This is Liz Colburn, host of The Morning Uplift. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Oh, the sweet, sweet tones of Luther Vandross. That could only mean one thing. March Madness is back. Hi, everyone. I'm John Lauder.
And I'm Christian Heimel. We host the Cheap Seat Sports Podcast on Mondays. We're excited to invite you all to the first ever Public House Media Bracket Challenge.
Now is your chance to prove that you know more about college basketball than we do.
And then hear Johnny and I complain about it each week.
Oh, that's for sure. All you have to do is check out our Facebook page, the Cheap Seat Sports Podcast, find the link, and enter.
Only one entry per person, though. Prizes will go to the top listeners, especially the ones who beat out Public House Media hosts like John and myself.
And don't forget, to be eligible to win, you must like both the Cheap Seat Sports Podcast and the Public House Media Facebook pages.
That's simple, guys. 2 clicks, like the pages, join the group, and good luck in the inaugural Public House Media Bracket Challenge.
Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppie. Find out some about me at danielpoppie.com. If you do like this podcast, please like and share on Facebook and or other places that you see it, because that is a big help. If you like it if you enjoy it, please rate it on iTunes. And if you enjoy it as well, check out Public House Media. This podcast is brought to you by Public House Media. The word of the week is a word. The word means the day before yesterday, and when I think I've heard at least one person who's said that there should be a word for that, and there actually is a word for the day before yesterday. Now, I don't know if there's a word for the day after tomorrow. I think the British use a word for the day after tomorrow, and I'll have to find out what that is, but I can't exactly remember what it is. But the word of the week is nudiestertion, and it means the day before yesterday, and when I read this word, I was thinking, well, you're never going to use this word, first of all, because it's too long. Because saying the day before yesterday is just about as long as saying nudity assertion. It might be just as many. It might be as many syllables to say one and the other. So that is our word of the week, and if you use it, people will probably look at you funny, and no one's going to know what you're talking about. But at least you know another word. You're expanding your mind. So the accidental essence that we're talking about today, I've said this before, and I've said that I'm going to be doing two days of an accidental essence. I've said that before because I wasn't sure if it was going to go long. But I'm almost certain that this is going to go long. I think it's going to go into 2 different podcasts. We are going to be talking about obsession. And specifically, we are going to be talking about fandoms. And by we, I mean me, because you're not actually talking. So, before we get into this, I just want to briefly touch on what I am defining a fandom as. And I think that you can define it in different ways, okay? So you can define a fandom as a group of people who enjoy a specific thing. They are fans of a specific thing. But when you typically think of a fandom, you don't necessarily think of someone who is just a fan, okay? So there's a lot of things I'm technically a fan of. I enjoy the show MASH. If you've seen this past Sunday, my favorite TV show is MASH. So Public House Media put a thing up about me this past Sunday because they spotlight some of their show hosts. And my favorite TV show is MASH. I'm a fan of MASH, but I am not a fanatic of MASH, if that makes sense. I think it does, because I can like MASH, but I don't have to be all about MASH. My whole life doesn't revolve around MASH, or even if I start talking about it, I don't go crazy when I talk about it. I usually just say, hey, that's a really good show. You should watch that show. When you typically think of a fandom, it's more along the lines, I think people view it along the lines that I define it as. So when I think of a fandom, defining a fandom, a fandom, according to me, how I'm talking about it on this show for this episode, and maybe another episode. So next week's episode as well, I'm almost certain it's going to go into 2 weeks, is a group of fans who have interactions with each other that is marked by their relationship to the object of the fandom and marked by obsessiveness. Okay? All right? So I used to live with some guys, and they were great guys, and I'm not trying to be mean to them at all. And there are certainly things that I really, really, really like I'm obsessed with. Okay? I would say that there are certain things that I that border on obsession for me. But they really were into Star Wars, and they didn't ever go to, maybe they did. Maybe they went to a convention of some sort. Okay, let's just say that they liked it so much. It wasn't like they were all about Star Wars. They were certainly into a lot of other things. I enjoyed their company a lot. But I could see them going to, what's the party? There's a Star Wars party that goes on every, I can't remember what it's called, but there's a Star Wars party that goes on. And it goes on, I don't know if it goes on every year or every so many. It's Star Wars Celebration. I don't know how often it goes on, but it goes on, I think it's every single year, but who knows. So Star Wars Celebration, I could see them going to that, and I could see them having fun with that, but at the same time, they're not extremely obsessed with it. It's not the only thing they can talk about. So some notable contemporary fandoms that I would say actually are marked by fandomness as I talk about it. So there are certainly groups of people who enjoy stuff, and you see these people, you're like, oh yeah, they're fans. And in our current culture, maybe you would even say, oh, these people are fans of this, that are of this fandom. But some fandoms that I think are actual fandoms, or maybe some of these may not be, but I think once you hear them, you'll be like, okay, they sure are. Harry Potter. All right, people go to see new Harry Potter films that they have in the past dressed up, and I know people who do that. I'm not sure if Game of Thrones is a fandom, but I think Lord of the Rings is, because Lord of the Rings is one of those movies where people were obsessed with it, and they would wait in line, and anything you buy or anything you spend your money on and you wait for, like you'll wait in a huge line to get, I would consider it like there's a fandom around that thing. So maybe there's more than I think. I would say that would include Apple. Apple is a fandom because, and probably other forms of media like that. I'm just singling out Apple because historically, in the past decade, it's been the case that people have stood in line to get their new iPhone or whatever thing. Rick and Morty, please kill me. Okay. All right. So those are some different fandoms, and I say Rick and Morty, please kill me because I think Rick and Morty's fandom. I'm sorry. I like the show. I think it's clever. Their fan base is insane. Okay, like not insane in a good way. They're just annoying. So a lot of these are connected to art. So a lot of fandoms, as I'm talking about them, are connected to art. But I don't think they necessarily have to be connected to art. I think they generally are. Another one that I think of is where was it? Harley Davidson. I think Harley Davidson is a fandom. So if you're a person and you drive a Harley and you have all the Harley leathers and you'll only ever buy Harley, and this can go along with someone who only drives a specific vehicle and they're obsessed with this type of vehicle, that's a fandom. It wasn't considered a fandom in the past, but it's essentially the same thing. That is your thing you buy. You love it so much, you'll do whatever. You'll get the newest of whatever. You have memorabilia about everywhere from it. You're part of a fandom. You're part of this obsessive type of fandom. And this obsessive type of fandom isn't new, as I was saying with Harley Davidson, because if you've ever heard of Elvis, that you know that people were obsessed with Elvis, the Beatles, and there's a composer. His name is Liszt. So Liszt, his name is spelled Liszt. So he was actually a Hungarian composer, and he was writing music in the 1800s. And so in the 1800s, in the mid 1800s, there was a frenzy about him going on in Berlin, and there were people writing papers about what was happening. There was his fans were hysteric about him. So if you look at the old videos of the Beatles coming to the United States, you have these girls, and they're teenage girls, and they're freaking out about the Beatles, and people were doing that about Liszt, and people had never seen that before. It hadn't happened before, but people were so obsessed with Liszt at the time, and it was in the 1840s. So the fandoms and people being obsessed with someone or something or a type of art certainly aren't something new in the world. And there's reports of people being obsessed with Liszt. I think it's Liszt. I'm almost certain it's probably something like Liszt or something like that, but I'm just going to say it like that. If I'm saying it incorrectly, you can certainly correct me. But the thing about Liszt is the fact that there were people who had a lot of prestige themselves. There's reports of people who had a lot of prestige who are actually obsessed with him as well. So they had the same frenzy about him. So it's kind of bizarre. So being obsessed with art is nothing new. Being obsessed with a celebrity personality is nothing new. But we didn't see it as often as we do today. And the reason why I say we didn't see it as often as we do today, because people were looking at the listomania as like a phenomenon that they had never seen. They're like, this is really bizarre. They actually gave it a specific name based off of the composer because they just hadn't seen it. Maybe it's the case that it happened, but it just never happened on such a widespread. Okay, so I'll take a second to explain what I mean. In the recording didn't skip. I just stopped talking. So if you look back in history, there's certainly people who were obsessed with specific artists, and there were certainly people. I would bet a lot of money on the fact, but you can't prove it, so it's a bet that's never gonna. We're never gonna figure out what happens with the bet. But I would bet a lot of money on the fact that there were people throughout history who knew about artists or knew about people creating art or anything that was creative in general. Maybe it was a specific. There were people who were creating a specific type of a cart. They were wheelwrights, and they were really good at what they did. It's bizarre. Maybe there were people. Well, if you think about it, there's watchmakers. There's like Rolex watches. Is Rolex from Switzerland? I can't remember. But there's Rolex watches, and maybe there were people obsessed with Rolex watches at some point. I don't know how old Rolex watches are, but throughout history, there's certainly been people who are obsessed. But there wasn't certainly as much widespread obsession. Otherwise, you would have realized there would have been more reports of it. This would have been something that wouldn't have been out of the ordinary in the 1840s, right? And you would have had people saying, "Oh yeah, this is typical." When a musician comes to town, people freak out. But in Liszt's case, it was really out of the ordinary that they actually gave it the term Listomania. There's actually a band that is called Listomania, or it has an album named Listomania, I believe. So the question is, why? Why is this different than the past? Why is it the case that there were certainly people who were obsessed, and there's always been people obsessed with something in the past. But why has this obsession become essentially a fandom? There's a group of people who are just extremely excited. There's almost a hysteria about something. You can look at people who get wheeze on the YouTubes. I was about to say, you look at people who get wheeze on the YouTube, or they get something they really enjoy, or you see people there's this whole thing with video games where you are paying more money, and it's essentially a lottery, and it's not really it's essentially like a what do you call it? You crank it, and then money comes out. There's the cherries, the slot machines, because slot machines, you pull it down, and there's an algorithm that controls when it happens. It's not really a lottery when you pull down a slot machine. I mean, if you roll a die, and that's a lottery because you're not certain what's going to happen. But a slot machine, that's already programmed. Like, don't even go to those things, because it's going to be the same no matter what, because it's just going to be the specific algorithm. It's going to be the specific pattern eventually. So just, I don't know why people would go to them. But I don't know what I was talking about now, so I've got to get back to where I was. Okay, so in the past there were people obsessed, and right now there are certainly people who are obsessed. And I was talking about the fact that there's people, you pay money, and it's essentially like a slot machine, and you get a specific thing in a video game, and people freak out about it. It's amazing. It's kind of sad. I think it's kind of sad, but I mean, people get extremely excited about it. It's crazy. So why is there such hysteria? And I guess that's a little different because that's more like gambling, but the hysteria is the same. But why is there such this widespread hysteria in some cases? So if you look at Star Wars Celebration is weird. If somebody invited me and they paid for my ticket, I don't know if you get a ticket. I'm assuming you get a ticket. I would go just to experience it. If somebody invited me to a Comic-Con, I would go if they paid for my ticket. I don't know if you get a ticket for that either. I'm assuming you do. See, I'm so out of the loop with it. I would go just to experience it. I wouldn't care. I'd be like, all right, sure, that's fine with me. But it wasn't. Why was it the case that we don't see those reports from the past? And I've got a few reasons, and some of them I think are better than others. It may be that there weren't as many people reporting on it. You just couldn't see. There's widespread hysteria maybe in some cases, but you just didn't have the media coverage we do have today, because our media coverage is insane. Like, there's just so much coverage, and you can have people who film it with their phones. Anybody can catch coverage of something happening. Or it could be the case that not as much media was obsessed with these types of things. So today we have this celebrity culture, right? But back then, maybe they just didn't care as much. They realized, they're like, oh yeah, we've got our own thing going on. We're just not as interested in celebrity as you. Or maybe we're not as interested in showing off hysteria as you. Maybe they were aware of it. And this goes back to media coverage as well. Or it could be the case that it's harder to find people who like the same thing. So it could be the case that that you may like something, but you're like 1 out of 10 people that you know who likes it, and you can't connect to hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of people who like that same thing. And therefore you can't come together and you can't be really, really excited about that thing together. So you'll just have to be excited to yourself. Or it could be the case that we just didn't have as much media, right? This is a little different. We didn't have as much media. So media, I mean, like, we didn't have as much music. We didn't have as much television, or no television at all. There weren't as many books coming out or anything like that. And there wasn't as much to get obsessed over, right? The final thing that I would say is probably where I would say is correct is a cultural shift, okay? So talking about the United States in terms of the cultural shift, there are... If you think about it this way, okay, and I'm not trying to make judgments on a specific idea that a person may have. So if you're someone who holds an idea that I'm talking about, and it seems I'm talking about it in a specific light, I have a bias. I definitely have a bias. I'm trying as best I'm able to look at something as objectively as possible, however possible that is, and I'm trying to look, okay, how were people in the past versus how they are today, and how might that have been made people different or look at things differently than they are today, okay? So I'm not trying to rip on any one group, actually. I'm just trying to make observations, and I'm just trying to talk about something. So in the past, people were more traditional, all right? I would think most people would agree with that. I'm going to be talking about the United States right now. In the past of the United States, people were more traditional. All right, so specifically the United States, and we can extend that farther back, and we can extend that back into like Western civilization. So Western civilization, I would include the point at which Rome became Christianized. Okay, Western civilization from the time Rome became Christianized to the present in Western countries. So Western countries, though you may not think it to be the case, so you may be completely an atheist, but there are a lot of things that come up through our culture that are Christian ideas, okay? But in the past, if you think of somebody who's more traditional in the United States, you typically think they're religious, and the people who are more religious tend to, in my opinion, and I think this is true, I think that if you actually did a survey, people who tend to be more religious have more of a focus on family, and so they have more of a focus on family, all right? So these people who tend to be more religious, and they have more of a focus on a metaphysical reality like God and heaven and different things like that, okay? So if you are more focused on those things, it's less likely that you're going to be focused on others. I think that makes sense. So if you focus your life on one thing, if you focus your life on family, then other media sources aren't going to be as important, okay? Today, people are more focused on self-fulfillment, I would say. I think that our culture has shifted, and I think that it's something that's pushed out in the media a lot. Maybe you don't think that way. Maybe you're like, I don't actually think self-fulfillment is extremely important. I think my dad doesn't agree with this. He actually laughs at people who try to go out and find themselves. He's like, this is ridiculous. This isn't true. This is a bunch of crap. That's his opinion. I'm quoting his opinion. So there you go. But if you're more focused on self-fulfillment, so think about it this way. If somebody says, so you're in a religious family, someone says family is really important, all right? They say family, like like a nuclear family, is really, really important. Then you are going to focus your energy on a nuclear family because there's a solid thing. You can touch it. You can touch the people in your family, and you can actually see them, and you can see how things affect them. Therefore, you can react to the world in a way that is very tangible to take care of those people, right? Okay, family is important, but self-fulfillment is a bigger umbrella. You don't really know what fits under that. It's not clearly defined for you. So if someone tells you, "Oh, go out and find fulfillment in what you do," go out and find fulfillment in for yourself, you don't even know what fulfillment is. Because for me, I don't necessarily so if I took this idea of self-fulfillment, I wouldn't necessarily think happiness is self-fulfillment. I think that being happy is a nice thing, but when I really come to start to think about it, my self-fulfillment, this is very subjective, okay? The family thing, I think, is less subjective if you think about the nuclear family and taking care of people. But the self-fulfillment thing is very subjective. So if I started to think about it and I argued on it, I would say, oh, well, self-fulfillment isn't necessarily me being happy. Where other people may argue that self-fulfillment is if you're not happy, you're not fulfilled, right? Okay. Other people may argue if you're not being generous, you're not fulfilled. Other people may argue that if you're not chasing after your dreams, if you're not going after your dreams as hard as you can, you're not fulfilled. Okay. So if you, within this paradigm of self-fulfillment, and I think this paradigm of self-fulfillment is actually springing from that Western Christian, Christian ideas, because I think that there's I know that a lot of people probably will disagree with it, and there's a lot of people who probably have issues with Christian ideas, but there is an idea within the New Testament that people have dignity, and I think it's hard to argue against that. I think people who aren't Christians may argue, oh, well, Christianity has all this death and all this killing in the Old Testament, but when people argue that, it's really somewhat of a straw man, because Christianity doesn't base all of its thought on the Old Testament. Actually, the majority of Christian thought is based on the New Testament. So you really have to look at the person of Jesus in the New Testament to really base what Christianity thinks, all right, how they think, or the basic ideas of Christianity. And there was a specific dignity coming from that tradition. And this dignity, I think, goes into this idea of self-fulfillment. I think there's a lot of things that someone who is a traditional Christian might be like, oh, well, that's not a good thing. But it actually is an outgrowth of Christianity. And if you want to argue that thing it's an outgrowth of Christianity, but it's a distortion of Christianity, sure, argue that. That's fine. But I think that some things like this are. So if you don't have a clear idea of what to focus your life on, so let's just take family out of the picture. Let's just say that your life should be focused on getting money. I think that's a really straightforward goal. Like, we're not talking about self-fulfillment. Your life is just focused on the fact that you should get as much money as possible. This is tangible and it's easy to focus on, but self-fulfillment isn't. So for some people, and in our culture, self-fulfillment is more like pleasure. It's more related to pleasure. So it's like, how can you be happy and how can you continue to be happy in your life? How can you get pleasure in your life? And I'm not going to say it's hedonism. I'm not going to say it's just a blind pursuit of pleasure, but there is an aspect of, I don't want to feel so much pain in my life. I don't want to feel like crap. I don't know anybody who really wants to feel like crap in their life. But within this aspect of self-fulfillment, I think that there's a tendency that people could have to look at all the media around them, and they could suddenly latch on to media that makes them happy if they're going towards that idea, and they'd be like, this media makes me really happy, so I'm just going to know everything about this media. I don't think this is a new thing in humanity, because people really don't want to feel pain. I don't think people want to feel pain. So I missed one thing that might be the case, and I'm going to put this in because I think that I wouldn't be, at least for me, when I was thinking about this, I wouldn't actually be presenting the whole argument. And this is probably a really good aspect. So before, I was talking about how things in the past may have not allowed people to become hysteric or be obsessive about a specific thing or form into fandoms as I've defined them at the beginning of this episode, okay? Now, there's one thing that very well could be the case and could explain it away. It could explain everything else away. I might be right about the other things I explained, but this one also could be right, and that's survival, okay? So it could be the case that people just didn't have the abundance of food. If you look at, I bet you, it's probably part. There's all of these different things that I mentioned. There's probably a certain degree where each of them are correct. And I'm not saying that just to say, oh yeah, like I just have all these ideas. But if you look at them, they make sense to a certain degree. There probably was more hysteria in groups than we actually know. There was not as much media back then, so people couldn't find their media niche that they really loved. I'm actually a person that really likes to I like media that other people don't know about. I like media that I just know about. I actually used to listen to music. I never tell anybody what I listened to for a long time. And I just like, hey, this is my music. I like this. I don't need to tell anybody else. And it is the case that it was harder to find people who like the same thing. All right. And our culture has shifted. So I'm not just trying to say, oh, they're probably all right. But survival is probably a big one of them too. Because if you look at somebody in a country that they're just trying to survive, they're probably not too concerned about their fandom. They probably don't have a fandom, okay? So, but going back to self-fulfillment, it's easy to slip. If you think about self-fulfillment and you go toward this idea of, I'm just jumping back and forth. If you think about self-fulfillment and you go toward this idea of happiness or pleasure, I guess, because sometimes we conflate happiness with pleasure, and I don't necessarily think they're the same. I don't think they're the same thing, because I certainly think you can have pleasure and be utterly unhappy. And I think I have had pleasure and been completely unhappy. But I think it's easy to slip into entertainment, especially in this time period. If you live in a country that's pretty rich, I think it's easy to slip into entertainment because entertainment is made to be enjoyed, right? Okay. So if a person is seeking after something else other than entertainment, that's not necessarily made to be enjoyed, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So a person who would look after entertainment, so they're trying to find their self-fulfillment, and they find this joy, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. They find this joy and this tons of excitement from this media that's been created, and because it makes them feel fulfilled in some sense, it makes them feel happy, it gives them pleasure, maybe even, they start to incorporate it into their personality, and then this incorporation into their personality may lead to obsession. All right, so this sounds actually to me related to addiction. Okay, someone who they're trying to find pleasure. I don't think it's as insidious as addiction. I think that you can be obsessed and addicted to things. I think that obsession of a media source or a specific type of media can lead to addiction. But the thing that is different than addiction. So if I love Star Wars, if I really love Star Wars, which I don't really love Star Wars. I enjoy it. It's fine. But if I really love Star Wars, I can keep on reading Star Wars, but eventually I'm going to run out of Star Wars stuff. For now. It might be the case they keep on making Star Wars stuff and I'll never run out of Star Wars stuff. But if I'm really a big fan of another TV series, eventually that TV series is going to run out. So even if I was addicted to it, people binge watch stuff. I really liked Stranger Things. I really, really enjoyed that show. I thought the storytelling was really, what would you call it, tight. Really tight storytelling. They didn't miss a beat. I thought it was excellent. I thought it was done really, really well, and it was done in a way they didn't try to be so complex. I don't think they didn't try to be super flashy. I think it was cool. Their visuals were cool with some stuff. It looked like a 1980s movie, but with that show, they really focused on characters. Their character choice was excellent. I thought it was excellent. And then you get to the end of the seasons and you actually feel connected to the characters. You're actually invested in the characters. So with that, I really like that show. I could probably watch that show. Like I could probably I'd probably get sick of a marathon, but I could probably watch that show in 3 days. What's out? The 2 seasons that are out right now, I could watch in like 3 days, but then that's over. That's it. I've consumed this in a way that's like an addict, but I can't consume any more of this media. But people naturally like things, okay? People naturally like things, and if something is made to be enjoyed, it's a pretty good combo for addiction, right? Okay? Because with regular addictive substances, they are highly enjoyable, I'm assuming. I really don't take a lot of drugs, or any at all. But they're highly enjoyable. That's why people take them. That's why people get addicted to them because they need them in a lot of cases. Like heroin, you actually get addicted because you don't want the withdrawal. But with media, I just lost my train of thought. With media, it's the same thing, and I'm coming to the end. I'm not coming to the end of my notes. I have tons of notes about this. I think it's really interesting. But I'm coming to the end of my time limit. And I think it's probably about time that I wrap this up. So I'm going to see if I have anything else to say. Okay, that's what I'm going to do. So we're going to jump over to if I can find it, we're going to jump over to the logical fallacy of the week. And I've got tons of notes for this week. I just kept on going with it and how it looks, but I may be wrong because I've been wrong in the past. But this is the first time I've been right. It looks like I might do 3 weeks on this. So the logical fallacy we're doing this week. So last week I did an ad hominem. And ad hominem, I'm like, oh, we're doing ad hominems because I completely forgot. I either did it last week or the week before. I can't remember completely. But I was actually doing red herrings. And ad hominems are actually red herrings because they are pointing to something else that isn't part of the argument. Okay? That's what a red herring is. We are doing red herrings, and I'm trying to do red herrings that are pretty relevant to our culture. And the red herring this week is the appeal to poverty. And I'm going to do an appeal to poverty right here. So I'm actually going to use the fallacy to argue for this. So the appeal to poverty, as it sounds, is that the arguer is poor, therefore the arguer is correct. Okay? Now, I could say that I could say that this is correct because I could say that I'm correct about this and I'm not attacking poor people because I don't come from a lot of money. I'm not a person who comes from a lot of money in my life. It's like just middle class, lower middle class, something like that. So I could be like, oh, well, I'm correct because I'm poor. But that's not the case. I'm not trying to rip on someone who is poor. I'm not trying to say, I'm not trying to say that I'm right because my family wasn't wealthy when I was growing up. I'm just trying to say that if a person is poor, it doesn't make their argument good just because they're poor, right? If your argument is good, it doesn't matter who you are. Like I was talking about, or I've talked about in the past, there are people who are evil who could have a good argument or who could have good ideas. There are people who are awful people who could look at a situation and they could go through the logical process with it and they could have an excellent argument about that situation. Now, do I want to have them as friends? No, right? Because I don't know anyone. There's no one I know who wants an evil person as their friend. But it's the same thing with a poor person. Just because someone's poor doesn't mean their argument is good. Just because someone's poor doesn't mean their argument is bad either. Just because you're rich doesn't mean your argument is good. It's kind of similar to there's the logical fallacy. It's called argument from authority. And what the argument from authority is that you believe someone because they're an authority. So if someone says, "Oh, I'm a scientist," or this scientist says this, right? This scientist says that you should eat 5 pounds of sugar a day because it's good for you, or this dietitian. Now, if you say that is good, if you say that, oh, I should eat 5 pounds of sugar because that dietitian says it, that is an argument from authority. And I would say that in some ways, this is really related. The argument from poverty is related to the argument from authority because it's all going back to a person. I'm just saying, oh, I'm letting the authority of this argument rest on someone else rather than logic. Okay? And I think that we really need to allow our arguments to rest on logic and we need to go through the process of actually thinking through the argument, try not to have logical fallacies, try not to contradict ourselves, and let our arguments rest on that. So I will be talking to you more about obsession and fandoms next week, and we'll see if we get through it all. But as of now, it doesn't look like we will. I am Dan Poppie, and this is How to Write Good.